He was struck with the fact that people with different shaped skulls had different character structures, different kinds of personalities. And he thought that by looking at the bumps on their skull, he could get a very deep insight in how they functioned as intellectual and social human beings. The first thing that gave him a clue about this was the fact that when he looked at the brightest people he knew, both among his classmates and among his teachers, he found that they had a very prominent forehead, often had bulging eyes. And those that had a more shallow intellect had a more restricted forehead and sometimes a more prominent back of the head. I was extremely skeptical of this view. I thought this was just blatant nonsense. How can one make an assertion like that? But then I began to look around among my friends, and I began to explore them and look at their heads. And I found to my amazement that Tom Jessel, one of my brightest friends, had a very prominent forehead. And some of the people in our group who had a shallow a shallow intellect had a less prominent forehead. So I really began to think that maybe there's something to this. And I began to read more about Gall. How did he get to this view? And he really developed a very, very interesting theory. He thought that if you use your function, like Tom uses his intellect, that part of the brain that represents that function, for example, a function of comparison, intellectual function, that would bulk up like a muscle when you're exercising. And that would cause the overlying skull to bulge out. And this made an enormous impact. People, when they first read about this, got very excited. And I could see there might be some merit to this. May I have a volunteer? Would you consider coming up here for 1 second?
Sure.
What is your name?
Carrie.
Carrie. Would you turn around? May I examine your head?
Sure.
No, face that. It's clear. I don't even have to do much palpation to see extremely intelligent person. Thank you very much. May I suggest that all of you, with appropriate permission from your neighbor, turn to your right and palpate the skull of the person next to you to get an idea whom you're sitting next to. You don't want to spend the rest of your life with people that you don't know. I want to tell you, please, go ahead. I should also tell you, so you not only evaluate people for their intellectual capabilities, because after all, we make friends on more than one quality of mind, the back of the head is involved in romance. So you can get a sense of how romantic the person is sitting next to you. The French were more skeptical. The French tend to be very skeptical. And the person to really challenge this in a very dramatic way was a giant in the field, whom I like very much, Pierre-Paul Broca. He, in about 1861, so it's about 40 years after Gall, said, look, I think that all mental functions come from the brain, and I think it's very likely that mental functions can be localized to specific regions. But this is not the way to go about it, by feeling people's skulls. You have to get inside and see what's going on in the brain. And so he argued, I had thought if there were a phrenological science that is a localization of function, it would be a phrenology of convolutions of the cortex, not a phrenology of bumps in the head. And therefore he suggested that mental functions could be localized to specific regions, but by correlating clinical pathological information. So he thought that if one examined people with specific disorders of brain function, see what symptoms that produces, one would really learn something. And he began to look around, and he decided he would study aphasia, a disorder of language, because he thought this was the highest mental function. If you get any insight into the biological base of language, you'd have a real insight into mental processes. And soon after he became interested in it, he came across a fascinating patient, Le Borgne. Le Borgne had an extremely interesting disorder of language, an extremely interesting aphasia, in the sense that he could understand language perfectly well, but could not express himself with language. Now, you might think this is a paralysis of the vocal cords, but it was not. He could whistle a tune perfectly well. He could hum a tune very well. Moreover, he could not express himself in language in writing. He simply could not express himself in language, even though his understanding of language was perfectly well. When he died and came to autopsy, Broca found that there was a lesion in his brain, at the front of the brain. He was now in a peculiar situation. He discovered this lesion in the front of the brain, and he wanted to name it. He wanted to write a paper about it. He wanted to discuss it with people, and he didn't know what to call it. So in all modesty, he ended up naming it after himself. What choice did he have? He called it Broca's area. He then collected 7 other patients that had a similar aphasia, difficulty in articulating language, but not a difficulty in understanding it. And he found that every one of those patients had a lesion in the front of the brain. And in each case, the lesion was on the left side. And this caused him to enunciate really one of the great principles of neuropsychology. Nous parlons avec l'hémisphère gauche, he said. We speak with our left hemisphere. This is really one of the profound insights. And I should point out when I'm speaking about Broca, this is the first person who really developed neuropsychology, the first person to take psychological data and neuroscience data and put it together. This galvanized the scientific community. People got extremely excited. They began to believe that something is real about localization of function, and they could study it specifically in experimental animals as well as in the human brain. And Fritz and Hitzig, 2 German scientists influenced by Broca, began to stimulate the surface of the cortex. And they found that there is a strip we now call the motor strip right behind Broca's area, also toward the front of the brain, in which movements are represented in a very systematic way. So if you stimulate a certain area, you activate the face, you stimulate a nearby area, the arm, further medially, the leg. We really were making progress in localization of function. And then another genius came along, Carl Wernicke. Person not dramatically older than you, was about 24 years old when he began to make this extraordinary contribution. He just graduated from medical school. In those days, one graduated from medical school quite early. He was in Breslau, Germany at that time, an extraordinarily gifted guy. He encountered a patient who had aphasia that was the mirror image of the aphasia that Broca had described. Wernicke's patient could articulate language, but could not understand it. When Wernicke's patient died and came to autopsy, Wernicke found there was a lesion at the back of the brain. Again, you know, he was in the awkward position. What was he going to name this green region at the back of the brain? He had a precedent, Broca's modesty, so in all modesty, Wernicke named it after himself, Wernicke's area. Now, Wernicke was an extremely thoughtful human being. He looked concerned with the expression of language, sort of like a motor function is in front of the motor area. My area, Wernicke's area, concerned with the understanding of language is in the back of the brain where a lot of sensory information comes in. This really means that mental functions represented in the brain can't be represented by a single area. Complex mental functions, he said, need to be localized not in a single region, but in several regions interconnected with one another. So Gall was not only wrong about the fact that he had a crazy way of localizing function, but he was wrong about thinking that highly complex mental functions could be restricted to a single area. They involved more than that. And he said to himself, look, isn't it interesting how these 2 areas, Broca's area and my area, are arranged in the brain? Broca's area, front of the brain, near the motor strip. My area, Wernicke's area, in the back of the brain, where sensory information comes in. In fact, you can see that the auditory cortex, which carries information from spoken language, is near Wernicke's area. The visual cortex, the back of the brain, occipital lobe, information about language that you read is in the back of the brain. Moreover, he knew that the auditory cortex and the visual cortex hook on to Wernicke's area. And Wernicke's area has a direct pathway called the arcuate fasciculus to Broca's area. And look, Broca's area is right near that part of the motor strip that is concerned with vocalization, with the actual motor apparatus for speech. And he put this information together in an extraordinarily prescient theory of language, which, although it was formulated in 1870, still explains 85% of the clinical phenomena one sees now in an emergency room in cases of aphasia. He said it works like this. If you hear spoken language or you read a text, that information is encoded neurally and passed on to Wernicke's area, where the understanding of language occurs. The information is then passed on through the arcuate fasciculus to Broca's area, where the grammar for language is located, and that hooks up to the area that is involved in vocalization of language and is connected to that. From this extraordinary model, which holds to this day, he was not only to give us an idea of how language is generated, but he made a prediction about the fact that one would someday discover a new kind of aphasia, which does not involve direct damage to either Wernicke's area or Broca's area. Can any of you guess what kind of a lesion, what kind of a disruption could give you a language deficit without interfering with Wernicke's or Broca's area? Yes?
A lesion in the arcuate
in the fasciculus that connects the two areas. Brilliant. You have a future as a neurologist without any question. A lesion that interrupts the pathway between Wernicke's area and Broca's area. What is now called in modern language a conduction aphasia. There you understand language and you express it, but the connection between it can be quite vague. It's like a presidential press conference. Information comes in, information comes out, but there's no connection between the two. Here is a patient with conduction aphasia.
And when we were getting ready to start this videotape, the producer asked us to count to 10. Remember that?
Yes.
Can you do that again?
Why? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7. Boing to Gabby people. Go. I can't.
No, that's really hard. Let me get you started.
I was stunned.
Okay. 1,
2, 4, 5, 6. Better send. Point.
Good enough. Let's.
Is that all right?
That's fine.
What is so interesting about this lady, she clearly is very intelligent, and she clearly understands the instructions, and she clearly can express herself in a very good way. But you could see how after a while she completely disconnects what she wants to do, what she's heard she should do, and what she actually does. What also came out of this is that we now understand from Wernicke and Broca's work how important the left hemisphere is for language. Because every natural language that you acquire, you learn a foreign language, that will be represented in Wernicke and Broca's area. The grammar for any natural language, not for artificial language, any natural language will be represented in Broca's area, number one. Number two, even if the language is not a spoken language, that is a sign language, is represented on the left side in Wernicke's area and Broca's area. So if you have a defect in Broca's area and you sign, let's assume you're a deaf person, you will not be able to sign. You will be able to understand other people signing because your Wernicke area is intact, but you will not be able to sign yourself because the Broca area on the left side handles all languages, including sign language. What about the right area? The right area is not involved in the logic of language. It's concerned with the intonation of language. Now, when we speak to one another, we communicate affect, emotion. I, in speaking to you, must convey to you that this is a great privilege for me. I immensely enjoy having the opportunity of interacting with you, and I hope you are listening to the intonation of my speech that attempts to convey that. So there is both the perceptive part and your part, which involves Wernicke's area, and the Broca's area and my part on the right side of the brain, not on the left side. So this raises the question, we've localized language, we've localized the motor strip, we know something about the right hemisphere. Are all mental functions, can they be localized in the brain? Can we localize specific areas for faces? Are there specific areas that are involved in our personality that make you who you are? Are there areas in the brain that are involved in social interactions that might be defective in autism? I think the answer is we're beginning to identify areas involved in all of these. I'm going to give you one example, but we can discuss the other examples later on. In the early stages, until around 1950, almost everything we learned about the human brain and about mental function came from studies of patients with one or another disorder and from studies of experimental animals. But a major revolution occurred about 20 years ago that made it possible to study people like you and me, intact, behaving subjects, awake, responding to certain tasks, looking at objects, examining objects, and this was through imaging experiments. For example, with functional magnetic resonance imaging, a normal person, this is absolutely painless, can lie in a scanner, and when they do a particular task, that area becomes active, it fires action potentials, it becomes more active. That requires more energy, there's an increased blood flow, there's an increased oxygen, and that signal is taken by the scanner and is able to indicate what area of the brain becomes active when there's an increased oxygen demand in that region that is being recruited.